Welcome everybody. I have to give the thank you, Natasha. Okay, so I'm going to give you the screen sharing. So what I wanted to say is that we have several classes of the situations when discussing the hamstring issues. So one class, it's the more severe class. So this type of the situations that you see here. So that would be the extremes in the children who are more on the depleted side, the quadriplegic situations and so on. And that translates into the situations like this, and like this, and then like this, and so on. So these are the really extended contractures of the hamstring, but which are being put in the context of the total limitation and the total depletion in the development. That's one class, right? And obviously you see both the limitations of mobility and those kind of extreme tightnesses of the hamstring. So that's one class. The second class that we are looking at, that would be the class of the hamstring limitations, which is present at the kids who are in overall better condition. So typically the ones who will be labeled as the diplegic. So the ones who have generally better strength in the upper body and so on, apparently, right, but have troubles with the legs mobility and control. So, and here today, well, Consta is one of my favorite models for this illustration. So sending greetings to Team Consta and Curry. So, and also, we've got some milder situations, right? So you see, this is when the child is, not showing the limitations of their mobility, but has limits of control, right? So that's what we have in this type of the situation. So these are the classes of the situations that we are dealing with, right? And here, of course, we get into the next domain where we have to explore what are the similarities and differences between the situations, right? What are the big picture issues? So, like, what's in common between the severe and less severe things? Why this whole thing is inextensible, and so on. And why it resists stretching attempts, and actually on opposite, the stretching attempts have a tendency to make it worse in the long run. And of course, the bigger and next level of the practical thing, so how we can arrange and what we shall do in order to improve the situation, right? So what avenues, what approaches, what critical points we have to address in order to improve the situation, and what are the challenges along this way that we might face, and what kind of cascades we have to integrate this whole thing into in order to be able to achieve this progress. So that's their general disposition. Okay, so I'm not going to spend too much time on their primitives, and primitives being their measurements, right? So although this is how, and this is the type of the information that you typically get from the physical therapist, right? So you see, in that sense, what we have in the physical therapy, we've got the measurement of that angle between the line of the femur and the line of the lower leg, right? And then comes the estimate of their comparison of the position of the leg, the maximum angle of extension of the leg in comparison to the straight line, and respectively here, if the maximum angle is, say, 180, right? So you see that will be the flat thing, so the full 180 extension. Oh, sorry, or the 0 degrees, if you wish, this way. So, of course, what we're going to see here is the significant limitation, which will be probably like 70 degrees or something like this, right? So that's the limit that we are facing over here. Now, of course, the natural tendency for everybody would be to try to do the stretching. So stretching there are two ideas of stretching which immediately come to mind, right? If we put the just a regular engineering mindset. So we have one idea of thinking of the whole thing as the muscle length limitation, and respectively, if you think about it as a muscle length limitation, then you would say, aha, it's a great plan either to press from the top so that you will be then able to get the force downwards, so that will create the stretching impact or the elongating impact on the muscle. Or it's also quite obvious, right? If you flip the child into a prone position, then another idea would be to start moving the leg towards the line of extension. So trying to get something like this, right? So you're trying to pull this portion of the muscle so that you would actually be pulling the muscle into the elongation. Now, what do we know? That these approaches, they don't work, right? So when saying don't work, what does it actually mean? So that means that this fight for so-called keeping the range of movement in the leg, or in the knee, it starts very early, and there is lots of efforts which are being done for that. But the typical thing is that despite all the efforts which are put into the elongation of the hamstrings, the hamstring keeps shortening. And you see, to a certain extent, one might say, well, but it's a strange thing because, look, it's a big muscle, seemingly it's easy to access, right? And we have even more than one way of stretching it, right? So one is via that kind of closed sequence, the closed chain with two fixed points. If we press from the knee and try to elongate it, and the other one is with the open one when we pull it via the grip at the heel. Why it doesn't respond? So that's, of course, the question. And of course, there's one more thing which might be sort of misleading there, because if you try to do that, if you try to do this and spend, I don't know, 10-15 minutes on trying to do this, as always, what you're going to see, you're probably going to get like 10-15% of immediate mobility following their intensive stretching session. So that's the thing which always happens. So when you do it within a single session, you kind of get the impression, oh, it's been stuck and now it's a little bit more movable. And the logic then kind of goes, aha, now if I keep stacking my effort and keep pulling it, so if I get 10-15% improvement today, then, and I kind of keep going this way, then in the long run, I'm going to achieve something. So I'm going to get it sort of going, and I'm going to get those additional degrees of mobility. Unfortunately, that's not the way that it works, and that's kind of one of the paradoxes. And that's one of the things which actually the hamstring demonstrates very well, that despite the easy access and despite the really frantic efforts to deal with it, unfortunately, there is not much coming in terms of the achievements of the stretching sessions. And of course, when we talk about this first modality of pushing the closed chain and pushing the knee inwards, so obviously that is possible in the horizontal position, but it's also possible to do in the standing frame, right? So when you force the child's knee into the straight position in the standing frame, that's exactly what you're trying to do. You're kind of trying to get this hamstring stretching through it. So that's the logic. Now, what we know is that this logic doesn't work, right? So this logic doesn't work. Well, there is two obvious things for it. One obvious thing is because after a while and after futile attempts to do this, we get to the situation when the immediate recommendation is to do the Botox injections, right? So Botox injections into the hamstring, that's extremely popular procedure. And for many children, it starts as early as being like 3-4 years old. So without waiting even for longer periods. But even with that, you do the sort of Botox. Apparently, it gives you some improvement in the range for a short period of time, but then the whole thing starts getting back into that shortening, apparent shortening again, right? And then after the Botox, the next very popular procedure is the tenotomy. So the tenotomy, teno for tendon, tomy for cutting, right? So tenotomy is the cutting of the tendon. So, and of course, there is also milder versions like the fascia tummy. So again, fascia is the target, that tomy is cutting something. So that's what in Europe you have the clinics of Ulzibat, Nazarov, and these are the Nazarkin, and if this type of school actually comes from Russia originally in the like 80s, and in the States you have this famous Dr. Nutso and some of his competitors who are also doing those like fascia releases. So again, whenever we hear the word release or some tenotomy or whatever, that's basically their acknowledgement that their so-called conservative, right? So the stretching, manual stretching, or the other forms of stretching, so they are considered to be conservative. So not conservative, not surgical. And of course, part of the attempt to deal with the hamstring is also could be using, not really so much used now, but especially in the past, those would be the kind of the casts when the leg would be forcefully straightened and then put into the cast, like via serial casting or one-off casting, and then trying to keep it there. And also the types of the extended the high AFOs, right? Because there are DAFOs, CAFOs, and so on. So that would be more the CAFOs. So all of those things fail, and that's why eventually the bigger treatments are being then implemented, like multi-level surgery and so on. So that's their situation. Of course, what's their typical explanation behind it, right? So the typical explanation actually comes in two lines, right? There are two main lines of thought. So one first line of thought is standard it's standard for the entire procedure, for the entire management of the cerebral palsy, is that we, namely physical therapy or the orthopedic approach, we do everything right. So namely trying to elongate the muscles, we do everything right. But unfortunately, the brain injury itself keeps sending the wrong signals, right? And those wrong signals generate the pathological contraction of the muscles. That's why our good efforts, which are bringing this nice 10-15% of the mobility for every session, our nice good efforts are not stacking up because everything is broken in the brain and then it just pulls the muscle. So again, the reasoning for this is quite straightforward, as always, that if you take the healthy people, and for example, a healthy person who has a broken knee or something, or broken, not really the knee, broken femur or something like this, and has been immobilized with a bent knee, then develops some hamstrings contracture, right? But after the release from the cast, those stretching sessions typically bring the improvements and the kind of mostly the restoration of mobility. So the logic of the physical therapy and orthopedics at first glance is rather straightforward, right? So if doing this stretching for regular people seemingly works, then, well, when we try to do this for special populations, why it doesn't work? Well, not because we are doing something wrong or missing something, but because the brain keeps sending the wrong signals. So our good work is always being undermined and destroyed by this unfortunate but miserable and broken brain. So that's really the message behind it, right? And the second kind of maybe less obvious but still clear message that comes with it is that it's their change of the muscle composition. So the muscle composition itself becomes more and more fibrous. So in other words, if we look at the muscle and look at the proportion between the fibers of the myofibers, the muscle fibers as such, and the proportion of the muscles of the connective tissue, that fibrous component grows. So then even the surgeon who kind of does the big cutting of the hamstring then points out and says, you know what, look guys, no wonder that you can't stretch this thing. It's been like so tough that I dull my scalpel on trying to cut through it. So of course there is no surprise that your manual efforts are not bringing enough results. So just they can't. And of course that brings us back to this whole thing. It's like if this thing becomes so tight, so so fused and so kind of fibrotic, so then of course in this scenario, well, how could you possibly expect that any kind of soft technique is going to bring any sort of the positive results, right? So that's really the logic of the whole approach. So that's where we are. So we have to remember then this few things. So the logic behind it is the logic of muscle transformation, muscle shortening, and the of course the wrong signals. So and in that sense, that's why the story goes that in the beginning is better, but these wrong signals keep coming and they keep kind of forcing the muscle to contract further and further and further. So that's the logic behind it. As I said, it's not unique to the hamstring, but hamstring is a good illustration of this principle because it's a large muscle, it's a kind of open muscle, and if, for example, the biceps of the arm, it's only affected the kids with the quadriplegic situation. So this hamstring situation is very frequent for everybody, including the diplegic children. Once we know the layout, we have to ask ourselves the question, okay, how do we deal with it and what's the bigger picture? What's the other interpretation that we might have behind it? So for this, let's get to the illustrations. So as always, I have pulled some pictures from the internet so that you can enjoy this illustration. So here are the hamstrings, right? So if we look at the composition, so the hamstring is the common label that typically covers those three muscles, right? The biceps femoris, the semitendinosus, and the semimembranosus. So they are the ones which are going from the attachments at the sitting bone, right? And here, as we look at it closer, we're going to see that these are the attachments which originate there. So and this is the most detailed illustration, because it also gives us the kind of additional demos there, right? So the short and the long head of the biceps femoris, so the presence of the semitendinosus and so on. So we'll get to this a little bit later, right? But just for the time being, pay attention to this starting thing. So that has the attachments and attachments at the origin, and it has obviously the attachments at the insertions. So for this, let's get into this picture, which I really quite like, because it gives us several components of this muscle illustrated very straight. So what do you see? You're seeing that each of those are attached at the sitting bone. All of them, right? So that immediately brings us to the first very important point. What is a hamstring? Hamstring is a connection that starts at the sitting bone, right? So the ischium tuberosity, and goes all the way under the knee, right? Goes directly to the lower bones. It goes to the medial and goes to the fibula, right? So you see, look at this. So one head goes to the medial condyle of tibia, right? So medial condyle of tibia is just the medial point, like the if you look at it from the the inside and outside. So the medial is the one on the inside. The lateral is the one out on the outside. So what do we see? That for this entire group, right? So you've got this line which shows you that it goes from one connection and splits into two, but both of them are below the knee level. So what kind of conclusions we can make out of this? So the common biggest attachment is here. So let's make first level of conclusions. So they are quite obvious. The quite obvious thing comes back to us from this picture, because you see this picture is more kind of elegant, right? If I zoom in, it's still kind of artificial, but you can see that the point of attachment, this whole area of attachment, is very, very blurred. See, it's critical. The attachment in this area, is critical, right? So because the whole thing, the potential length, see, if we look at it from the side, you see, if we look at it from the side, we understand that this is the distance that starts here and then ends here. See, that's the first point to understand. The hamstring itself has nothing really to do with the upper leg, in a way that it's a thing that runs parallel to the bone, but its attachments are above and below, right? So you see, if we look at the map, if we look at the anatomy, what are we going to see? We are going to see these basics, right? If we look at these basics, right? So what do you see? Three parts. This part is the pelvis, right? Pelvis. So the ischial tuberosity belongs to the pelvis. Then you've got the femur, right? The pelvis, the femur, and you've got the lower leg. So represented by the tibia and fibula. So 3 parts. 1, 2, 3. Hamstring. What does it do? The hamstring actually connects the pelvis to the lower leg. When it comes to the femur, it sort of travels parallel to. That's the very first important point for us to recognize. It's not being so much the intrinsic part or intrinsic friend. It's just another part that runs parallel to the bone. So that's one first thing. So therefore, why this reasoning is important for us? So because then the critical attachments are above the femur and below the femur. So if we have something happening at the level of the pelvis and something happening at the level below the knee, well, those two attachments, they are going to change the way how the entire thing works, right? So that's has to be very clear. And we get back to this drawing. So the first questions that we actually have to ask are, how good are the attachments at the origin? How good are the attachments at the insertion? And this is really the critical thing, which is not being studied in the standard physical therapy. But when it comes to the hamstring, this is a critical thing. You see, if you look at the connections, you will see this fundamental critical point that the whole attachment itself could easily blur. It could easily shift. And you see here the cost of the slight change in the attachment itself is very, very high. Because you see, fundamentally, you are expecting this thing to be attached at the bottom of the sitting bone, right? At the edge, which is kind of bottom and the back at the same time, right? So you see, this is a tricky thing. So now imagine this situation. Imagine, don't have to imagine, you just have to look at your own child, right? So the situation when you look at this part and this attachment, which is really kind of a big, flat, relatively flattish bone there, and it's a big plate of attachment which goes there. So it's like a flat, kind of flat strip cable. So the thing is, which parts are more active? Because the moment your bone, your attachment shifts behind, you're gonna get a problem. Let me try to find. See, especially it could be very well seen when we look at it from this side. You see, look, if I draw these lines, so I'll draw this line, right? Now, see, it's very, very critical that there is this kind of depth step under the bump, so that if you look at the whole thing, it goes under, it gets connected under the pelvis. Because the moment this connection from being under the sitting bone shifts even a little bit behind the sitting bone, that has critical influence on the angles. So it becomes something like this, right? You suddenly get this additional thing. So this extra, I don't know, centimeter, extra half an inch of a shift at the sitting bone is going to be equivalent to probably like 30 degrees of their change in their hamstrings, if you recalculate it into the limits of the knee. So I hope that this is clear, but if it's not exactly clear, please put your questions in there right now into the chat, so Manu is able to monitor it, right? So that I can get back to it. But maybe let me show even better this. This is a very schematic drawing, but it might be even better to understand. Because you see, this is a critical thing. So the moment your hamstring slides a little bit more backwards at the back of the sitting bone and not under, then the angles critically change. If we get back to Konsta's picture here, you see, this is the part. If you have the connections, if we were to draw the pelvis here, right? So you see, if the muscle was traveling below, that's one thing. But if the muscle suddenly goes behind, that's a completely different thing. So because the pelvis has depth, so if you're behind that edge, suddenly you get big, like if you get this, right? So you see this, the total change here is maybe 1 centimeter, but in terms of angles, that's like 30 degrees. So, and when it comes to the knee, those 30 degrees at the knee, they are equivalent to the same 30 degrees which you have lost at this little attachment there. But when it's a little attachment at the sitting bone, at the ischium tuberosity, it's not so visible. But when it's 30 degrees at the knee, it's very visible, right? Because either your leg goes flat or, you get this quite significant angle. So that's the first logic that we want to be very aware of, that the attachment has a critical effect on the situation. And if you look at your own kids, you're going to see that their attachments at this area, they are very, very blurred. They are not clean, sharp attachments where you can go under the sitting bone and so on. So you don't have this kind of step underneath. Because you see what happens if you look at the typical picture that you find, for example, on the internet when they tell you about the hamstrings, right? So this is the picture. The picture where the buttocks, right, the gluteal muscles sort of cover this attachment. But this is important because here, in order to cover these attachments, you need to have this big step underneath. You need to have this clear bottom. You need to have this very clear horizontal pelvis in order to be able to get this very clean positioning of the hamstring itself. So that's the first point. Attachments have a critical effect. So in other words, if we don't have clean, sharp attachments, if they are being shifted, right? So you see that's a shifted attachment, but there is also the B thing. Here, when we move the hamstring, we also expect that this attachment is also going to be very solid. That's another question mark. If the attachment is solid or not solid, if it's sliding or not sliding. Because if it's slippery, then what we are going to have, we're going to have the fake situation. So, for example, if you look at this thing and understand that the connection itself is behind, but it is slippery, that's going to give you the impression that the mobility is not too bad, right? So you see, if we were to get back to this picture and say, aha, you know, let's draw this. And for example, our attachment goes at the back, so it eats away this space. But on the other hand, this attachment is unstable. So it just slides back and forth within this range. So then what happens? You push at the leg or you pull it there, and then this end gets pullable. So you go, ha! I do the test, the hamstring is doing well. Now, that's the answer to this question, right? So how come that, for example, this boy has reasonable mobility of the hamstring, but when it comes to the action, it doesn't really show much? And this is where we really want to highlight this thing. Attachment and the leading hook of the attachment and the sliding, those are two different properties. So which means that sometimes in ABR, what we are experiencing the situation when the child apparently at some point might get worse in terms of the hamstring stretchability. Why? It's exactly this thing. So we're looking at this picture here, and our top priority is clean line, clean depth, clean bottom of the pelvis. That's our top priority. We don't want this thing to overlap, because that's the hamstring overlapping onto the pelvic territory instead of being attached under. See, that's a critical thing. So when you have a step that little, right? So you see, what is the, touch your own sitting bone. How much of a depth you have there? Like when you stand, you have the depth maybe like an inch, 2-3 centimeters, all you have. That's very, very little. But that is a critical distinction between the bottom of the pelvis and the back of the pelvis. So the hamstring has to be attached at the bottom of the pelvis. If it moves at the back of the pelvis, it's obviously completely wrong shift. So for us, the key thing is to get the pelvis, to get this clean attachment. So we have to get a clean distinction, and we don't want it to slide, right? Because it has to be a solid attachment. That's what attachment is supposed to be by definition, right? So you see, as we observe it in those pictures, say here, right? So you see, that has to be a solid attachment. It should not slide. That's the key, right? It should not slide. If it slides, then we are in a very bad situation. Because now imagine you are the brain. You are the brain and you have to control the action. But somebody gives you the shoes, which are, let's say, 3 sizes larger. Not much. You see, 3 sizes, the sizes of the shoes are 0.5 centimeter. So 1/5 of an inch. 3 sizes larger. This is what? This is 1.5 centimeters, just over 0.5 an inch. And if I give you the shoes which are 3 sizes larger, and I'm a nice guy, I will put some olive oil into it. So I'll pour some olive oil in your shoes and invite you to walk on a freshly mopped floor in a shopping mall. how would you feel about the situation? You know, you would tighten up to the extreme, right? For two reasons. One reason is that you are going on the, like in the shopping malls, they have those yellow signs, right? So slippery, wet floor, right? So, but now we want to add additional point here. Slippery floor, that's under your shoes, and the shoes are 3 sizes larger. And then you've got the olive oil there, because this is, this is zero friction within the different parts of, layers of fascia. Now you are the brain. What would you do in this situation? Well, in this situation, you will be completely desperate. You would not know, your information about your next step is going to be completely messed up. You're going to be in a very dangerous situation. You're going to bring your panic button, and your alert button and so on. So you'll bring your muscle tone to the maximum. But if somebody looks at you without understanding, without paying any attention to the context that you are walking in the shoes, which are 3 sizes larger, and then you're walking on the slippery floor, and there is olive oil in your shoes, and they just measure your tension, measure the tone of your muscles. They say, geez, this guy is a complete idiot. The weather is fine, everything is air conditioned, and he's showing these strange spikes of the muscle tone. Probably something is broken with his signals. So we have to give him some, I don't know, phenazepam or whatever, send him to the mental assignment, or give him some kind of shot of some muscle relaxants or some kind of brain, dumbing things so that he wouldn't do these strange things. So that's exactly the situation when we look at these attachments, when the brain needs to control this situation: pelvis, femur, lower leg, right? With the hip joint and the knee joint in between. So you are kind of standing, you have 5 slippery points there, right? I give you the example of just 3 slippery factors. The slippery floor, the big shoe, plus the additional, actually just 2. And that's already enough to be scared of the situation. Here you've got 5 slippery points. So of course the reaction of the brain is normal, right? So you see, this is what I want to bring over and over again. The brain is knows best. The brain is the smartest part. And this is what we always return to. If we don't get something, it's our problem. It's not the problem of the brain. The brain manages this extremely complex thing, which runs like, billions and billions of cells and the connections at the same time. How could we possibly label it as dumb, as doing the wrong decisions and saying that we know better? This is completely like arrogant and stupid. So that's the first point, so that you have to understand the value of the attachments. And that's why, as I said, for us, the critical point is to get the proper point of attachments, meaning activate the bottom part and make it steady. We want those attachments to be steady. This is what we want. But of course, what happened if you were, prior to this, doing some years of stretching, then you were just pulling the leg, right? You were just doing this action where you never really thought what you're doing, right? You just kind of, you, a physical therapist, whoever, right? You never really ask yourself what is happening there. Is it the insertion, or is it the origin, or which part of the muscle I'm actually stretching? You are just doing one big movement. You are either pushing at the knee or you're pulling the leg. That's it. Or you're pulling, like you're having a grip at the lower part. That's it. So, but what happens if you look at your leverage, the greatest leverage you are creating against the attachment, you are, by doing this, you can actively destroy this attachment. You're pulling this attachment, you're making it less stable at the attachment where it has to be the most stable. And by this, by destabilizing the attachment, you think that you are helping because you say, look, wow, I got more mobility. But it's impossible to start to stretch the muscle, but you can destabilize the attachment by this mechanical irritation and by this mechanical pulls. So that's why we have to be ready for this thing, that as we work and as the attachment at the pelvic connection improves, we then see the true nature of the trouble within the muscle itself. So that's really the big thing to understand. So that we have to get the attachments clean, solid, proper, because otherwise we cannot even judge the muscle. So that's the big number one thing, which is really like super obvious. Once you start, getting a little bit of respect to it, the moment you stop thinking about is that kind of as if there were some imaginary screws which were kind of bolted into the bone and keeping the muscle there. No, it's all blurred, it's all this kind of fine transition there. So now we move to the next part, which is actually even more critical. And fortunately, and that's where, Consta is going to be a great illustration for us. So, because he's a big, solid guy with great coordination, and he shows really lots of elegant things. You see the way how he gets the transitions from the floor, the way how you see like this, how he gets the transition from the toes into the thing and so on, and gets this coordination and the moves and so on. But you see, for him, really, he gets great coordination, but the legs are still moving under, right? So he can't unlock the hamstring, which is significantly better than what we've seen in the even like a year before. So you see, this is from the year before. So that's a short where you see the way how his legs were going under my legs, right? So you see, he wasn't able to clear it away from me, right? So you see, he was so pulled under that his legs were actually literally just getting between my legs. And here you can see that he is getting a lot more space in between and so on. But we have this problem of the knee extension and so on. In order to understand it, we move to the next step. So now we move to the next step of looking at the leg from here and starting to explore this build. So you see, I mentioned this point a little bit earlier, that the hamstrings run parallel to the bone. But this is the picture. You see, these are the front views, this is the back view. So what is it telling you? See, when you look at this picture and we look at the whole tensional connection, you also start understanding that, oh, by the way, when you look at this picture closer, you understand that the bone and the fascia of the adductor, they are actually playing the same role, right? So you see, look, you cannot, if you try to understand this picture, what you need to do, you need to draw this triangle. See, from the tensional perspective, this is a pure, clean triangle. See, as I draw it, you don't see any particular difference, because if you look at this as a complete triangle, it makes perfect sense. It's a very balanced system. If you try to look at the leg, at the bone alone, it's a very weird thing. Why this bone, which we want to hold the vertical position, why this bone is at this strange angled thing? Why is it not straight? So, but if you start looking at it from the tensional perspective, as opposed to the, compression, the triangle makes perfect sense. And why is it important? To understand that at the end of the day, there is also the cross section. Okay, well, this is good enough, right? You see the bone here? So look at this cross section. So when we look at the whole thing, we have to understand that's the external outer layer. This is the skin and the fat. This is the bone here, right? See, this whole thing is not particularly balanced if we just draw the circumference and draw the bone. So what do we want to do here in order to make the whole thing more balanced? We want and able to counteract the rotations, right? So you see, we want to add this whole thing. So we want to add this ability to balance it that way. But the bone is still the one that's supposed to be the leader. And when we talk about the leader, so that means we are looking at the two lines, one line, the other line. So effectively, from this, you want to draw this kind of image. How the connection between the bone and the skin fat, that's that primary thing that keeps the leg together. That's the main integration. That's the main network of the leg. And the bone in the cross section is like the epicenter there. So how do you test it? In a simple way. You grab the leg and you start rotating it. Right? So just start rotating it. Your own leg, very, very strong. Your own leg doesn't give much of the rotation because it has this type of the integration and so on. You see this large fat chunk and so on. But the bone is the leader there. Why is it so important? Because the twist is the most powerful action, right? So you see in the conversation about the move, the walking and so on, and about what was this the hip joint. I think what I was talking about the hip joint webinar. Our walking, our everything we do is powered by the twists. The twists have the greatest capacity for the twists have the greatest capacity for the energy storage. So, and at the same time for the controllable transfer where you get the exponential ability to hold it as you get the greater and greater resistance as you get the twist, and then boom, it unlocks and restores. So the perfect spring is not the one that is squeezed from the what, but it's a torsion spring. The torsion spring is much stronger than the squeeze spring. So if you want to use the controls, you need the torsion spring. But what it also means that if for some reason your connections either around the bone or around this ectoderm connections here, the mechanical fat, so now if you are missing this center piece, what's going to happen? What's your next best element to deal with the rotation, with the twist of the leg, if the bone is not holding? Well, I think the answer is very, very obvious. You've got two candidates there. Candidate number one is the hamstring itself. If you switch here towards the biceps femoris, right, it's this part, or it could be the switch that goes this way, that goes towards this side, right? So integrating the adductor. So this is what you get, because the frontal muscles, they are much softer. They don't have this, by composition, they don't have this tight membranes in them. So if the bone itself, if the connection, if the resistance to twist that the bone is able to provide is not strong enough, then you need the next best thing. And the next best thing is the hamstring. So when we look at the situation with Constar, that's his actually, and that's a critical thing for him. So he is doing extremely well in many, many dimensions, but this is his big trouble. And this big trouble is very characteristic, unfortunately, to the Finnish population in general. Well, among the CP, I don't know. Like you see, this is where we get this additional point, that different ethnic groups have different, like have slight differences between them in the fascia composition. If you go north towards the, original Vikings, they have very, very dense fascia, so they develop very stiff backs and so on, and they can develop very easily the contractures of the hands and so on. So if you go to Spain, Manu shows you that easy flexibility and so on. So you don't see the contractions, but you have very pronounced dystonic things. And then also, depending on the country, you have some things, but again, I just observe things, right? I don't make them up. I just observe what's happening. For whatever reason, in Finland, it just happened that kids in Finland, they have more troubles with this thigh to the femur integration. So with the thigh to the femur integration, you've got this challenge, that is the hamstring that effectively replaces the bone. It plays the role of the bone. What is the role of the bone? It's stabilizing, right? So you see, you want to be able to restrain the rotations and release them. So you want to become a very tight spring. What is it going to translate into? Is it going to get softer, or is it going to get tighter? Obviously, it's going to get tighter, right? If you try to stretch it, what's going to happen? It's just you're going to kind of cork this spring. So you're just going to make this bone, make this connective tissue respond even stronger. So now you add to the twisting spring, you add this kind of spring, like the old truck spring, which works this way, right? So you add additional spring property. You try to stretch it lengthwise, it's a spring which reacts the other way, right? So it's you take the pen spring and it springs back. So all of those things, they're going to make this translate into that further and further compactization of the hamstring. And most often it comes with what? It comes with the merge with the adductor. So a typical story is the adductor plus the hamstring. They merge together. What are they doing? They are replacing the bone. And now, once we understood this, it's a good thing for us to look at the more severe situation. So now when we look at this, what do we observe? Well, these are the kids who have really nothing. You know, like this is not just there, you know, because you see with Constant, his situation, or the more the kids with the diplegic situation, in their scenario, we have size, right? We have size, we have some layers are working, something is present. So you see like the skin fat layer, the mechanical fat integration, so they are working there, they contribute, they provide this matrix. But yeah, but the challenge there is that the upper part works, the more the ectoderm level works, but the connection to the bone doesn't. So it's a wobbly thing. It's like the, you know, at the, like at the center of the whole spring wobbles. So you have to replace it with the other thing. You know, you have to replace it with the biceps femoris. You have to replace it with this thing. So that's what happens. But when we look at the kids who are more on the weak side, they have the bone, which has extremely poor connection to anything else, and they have nothing else. You know, they don't have much of the skin connectivity, not much of the mechanical fat. So basically, the only thing which is left there, the only thing which has strong membranes in it, right? Look, these compositions of the fat and the strong membranes. Are you seeing them? You seeing? Let me just get them back, right? So you see, these are the membranes here. This fat deposits this membrane. So, and now once we looked at that, let's look at this picture. So what do you see? Bam, you are seeing this exact replacement. And if I get back to this drawing, right? So you see here, everything is very clear. Everything is very clear. Here you've got the membranes and so on. So these membranes are playing that stabilizing role. So now, if I put it even in a more simple format, you know, if I remove this bone, not, you see, not breaking it, but if I remove this bone from its ability to deal with torsion, because in order to deal with torsion, the bone has to have strong enough attachments. But in order for the bone to have the strong enough attachments, the bone and surrounding periosteum, the bone has to be alive. The bone has to have all sorts of these micropores and so on. If the bone dries out, it doesn't lose size so much. Unlike, for example, the muscle. The muscle changes the volume, right? The depleted bone doesn't become much smaller. It's a mineralized thing, but every, you know, like 5% of liquid in it translates into closure of all these multiple connections in the pores. And you see, you know, in order to understand the link that the muscle has to the bone, you have to look at it more as the idea of the syringe. See, the bone is part of the hydraulic connection. So the hydraulic connections, they have to work from the outer layers to the inner layers. Now, if you are trying to do the injection with the syringe, what is your greatest constraint? It's not the syringe itself, it's the needle, right? So you see, if the needle gets stuck, if you can't get through, you know, if you get hit something that you can't get the flow in, that's it. You can push as much as you like, it's not going to go through because liquid is incompressible. So, and that's why those the living bone, the bone has to be alive to welcome all these connections and all their layers, all the parts around it. And this is one of our central statements, that the X-ray shows you the bone in a way that it's not different from the dead, right? So you see the X-ray of the live person and the X-ray of the dead person, they are not very different. In fact, you cannot tell by the x-ray whether the person is dead or alive, because the bones look about the same way. So that's the critical thing to remember. So if we look at this, you can tell certain things in terms of the attachment and so on and so on, but whether it's dead or alive, you can't. And that's really the critical thing. So what we are looking at, and that's why it's so important to look at live people. So what we are looking at, we want to see the live connections. How much, so you see, every square inch or every square centimeter of the bone surface, how much of the useful connections it's able to carry. And you've heard it from me before, and I will keep saying this again and again. You know, the same x-ray, the same surface area, it will be like a glass building, or it could be like a rustic, you know, building in the countryside, the old style. And if you want to put your, you know, like the vines growing on it, that's the point. The vines, if you look at the surface of the glass in that sense is dead. 1 square centimeter of the glass equals 1 square centimeter of active areas. But 1 square centimeter of the wall in the rustic house, because of all these nooks and crannies and so on, it's going to probably be equivalent to 5 or maybe even 10 square centimeters. So it would be the same size can carry 5 or 10 times more. And this is the difference. That's why when we look at the x-rays, we cannot tell this. Whether this bone is good enough to carry, right? But instead of the vines, the bones carry their muscles. So this is really what you have to understand, that all of those muscles that we see here at the cross sections, they are attached to the same bone. So the more of that active surface area the bone has around itself, the more it allows for the attachments and for all this whole thing. So then the muscles can be free, soft, you know, dynamic, and all the other things. So that's the critical part. And on the practical side, that's what I was, you know, that's what I'm actually very happy in the, makes me very happy in the recent, you know, maybe months or the last kind of couple of years, because the introduction of the Vibra tools has given us a completely dramatically improved impact at the bone. So, and that gives us much better internal connections, which in turn helps to kind of turn this whole thing around and so on and so forth. So that's the basic logic of the hamstrings, and I really love the whole thing, because also probably I have to get one more thing, right? One more thing here, because also when you look at the back here, when you look at the connections which are happening here at the back, there is one more thing. So we talked about the bone and the muscle, but also we have to think about the skin itself. And that's one of the properties of the hamstring and the adductor. They, you can see here, that's thicker skin, right? So you see, if you compare even your skin at the back of your leg and at the front, it's thicker. And that's why when the bone doesn't play sufficient role in restraining that twisting properties, if the bone is not holding it well enough, then we understand it's getting replaced by the membranes of the hamstring and adductor. But then, of course, all the other components are being recruited as well. So in that sense, that's what happens. This back side, especially right under the knee, the closer to the knee, the more it's just gets closer to the tendons. So this is where the thing easily glues. And this is one of the additional dimensions that I always try to emphasize. When we speak about the challenges here, we discuss not the shortening. It's not the shortening of the muscles. You're not looking for the elongation of the muscle. It's the muscle which glues. It's the gluing. It's the compactization. Of course, it's a compensation. The brain, which deals with this slippery situation, and trying to deal with the shoes 3 or 5 times bigger and the olive oil in it, and trying to get some, like controllable situation, with you release all sorts of agents to get this thing going. So effectively, and as you can see here very well, of course, this type of the situations are just highlighting for you that what is this membrane? This membrane is just connecting the pelvis to the lower leg. It runs parallel to the bone. It's not the leg itself. The leg itself is round. The leg itself is round. When the leg is depleted in roundness, we have those strengths. So 2 lessons here, right? So we want to populate the leg. We are not looking at the hamstrings. We are getting our basic lesson for the depleted kids. We want the bone and we want the leg, which is going to go into the increased roundness. From the flat bone, tiny one, right? You want the increased roundness. That's the key. You want to reawaken all these connections. You want to reawaken the mechanical fat, the skin, the intercomposition of the connective, the mysiums within the muscles. And again, the critical thing is the bone itself. So that's why we look at all the other additional things, right? So you see what, for example, the ABR machine and the change of the leg. Is it going to influence the hamstring? Of course not directly, right? Because if the hamstring is short and you use the ABR machine, which would have the compressions across, right? So you see, if you do, if you draw a cylinder and you do the compressions across, but you are interested in the cylinder, but you want the cylinder to get longer, it doesn't make sense, right? Unless you're dealing with the total volume of the cylinder. You want to increase the volume of the cylinder. You want to bring the life back into the cylinder, because in that sense, you're understanding it's not short. It's been corrugated. It's been compressed. It's been underdeveloped. So you want the expansion. You want the expansion in the cross section. That's what you're looking at. That would be, for example, the ABR machine and the change. So the change of the hamstring is not going to come as the change of the hamstring in this state, but the more roundness, the more of the leg is going to get grown into it, the more it will integrate the hamstring into it. So that's the basic logic there. The same thing when we look for the additional items like the ABR fascia gel. Is it going to get far enough and give you some bigger changes within the hamstring itself? Probably not. But what we have noticed is that since this area itself where the whole thing comes very close, that's where the skin fat gluing is extremely strong. So therefore, anything that is going to help us with this ungluing is already a positive contribution towards the problem. So this is how we're trying to get into this, right? So you see, we're trying to get all sorts of additional components, because of course the hamstring, since it carries so much load in that respect, so it's the one which naturally, when it starts replacing the bone, of course it naturally like goes into the tightening, and it can, and it, since we understand at this picture that's a very membranous, right? So you see those names, semi-membranosis, right? Semi-tendinosis, and semi-membranosis. So these are the, means that those are the compositions which are so like they're close, semi-membranosis. So with this, it's a half membrane in that sense, right? Semi-tendinosis. It's sort of, it's dense to the point of being half tendon-like. So that's what we have to keep in mind when we look into those areas and when we look at them. So the hamstring is a great illustration in many sense, but to tell you the truth, it took me a long time to understand this kind of the critical role of the bone as the cross section, and how we can get one thing, and the other even more so how we can get there. So that's why, frankly speaking, like looking at the situations like this, say even 4 or 5 years ago, I would be sort of like how we are going to present to the family that probably he's going to have some like period when his hamstrings are going to look tighter. That was the reality which we had to deal with, because we didn't have so much capacity to impact the bone itself, right? Because like as the attachments would get better and so on. But now, with the vibration tools and their ability to get the bone, so in fact, what we're getting a much quicker response and much quicker ability to get this circumferential changes at the leg, thanks to the uh, productive contribution of the bone. So in fact, we are actually, like, situations like this are no more the ones when you have to kind of hold on, right? So it's, in that sense, it works quite smoothly, and in that sense, once you get this integration, then like the person starts getting the real leg usage, rather than what we see here, right? So where he's trying to replace, see, even though his hamstrings and his leg looks kind of decent, but what happens, right? So you see he tries to jump, and the jump doesn't happen, and you can see that he's trying to use the arms to do the jump, right? So we already discussed this point, that this is the way the person is trying to use the latissimus dorsi as this activator from the top, in order to get the whole pull, right? So, and this is the type of the scenario that we are dealing with here. So, but overall, these are the things for you as a summary to remember, right? So first thing that we discussed, attachments really matter, right? So attachments really matter, but matter in a good way. You want them to be very, 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 very steady. You want to be attached under the sitting bones. That's very, very critical. If they go behind the sitting bones, you are into the trouble. So that's one thing, right? So then we were discussing, the next thing was the cross section. The leg has to be round from the skin fat level. If it's not, then it just gets depleted. The third thing we were covering was actually, of course, the bone itself. So the central question is how much of the circumferential support this bone is able to give to the surrounding tissues, right? So that was the example of the glass wall versus the rustic country house wall. So, and the one more thing that we covered was the fact that, as you can see here, you see there's for a reason that those parts are more whitish, right? See, they are more whitish because this is where it's greater density by definition. Plus here, that's where you have the skin easily gluing to the to the underlying muscle, and thus creating this fusion bridge. So those are the key ideas around hamstrings, and I have to kind of restrain myself really, because I was like ready to go maybe for another hour or maybe more, but I hope that that is enough for you to get the idea. And of course, I want you to kind of highlight to this is that hamstring is an extreme example of the muscle which is very long, right? So it's a very long muscle. Even for the small child, it could be like 30 centimeters, right? So for a person my size, it would be maybe like 50 centimeters. So when we discuss the key principle of ABR, we want, we want to go from a small number of large muscles doing the very hard work, right? So we want to get the distribution. Large number, small muscles, and I will draw even increasingly small, meaning that we want to go into the even premuscular level, right? And doing disappearingly little work, namely being able to redistribute everything as a spring, right? So that's the logic that has to keep coming over and over and over, and just give it some of the hamstring specifics to kind of to illustrate it there. So I will fold this story here. We are like 1.5 hours after our 10-minute start, kind of a little bit slow off the blocks, but now I think that we kind of got into the relatively decent situation, and I guess it's time to move to the Q and A's, right?
So before we start with the questions and answers, let's say goodbye to Facebook viewers and future YouTube viewers once we post this part of the webinar online.
All right, so I hope that the future viewers and the current viewers and so on, that they got a relatively comprehensive view. So, and the central message is, of course, that to first of all to appreciate the true complexity of the way the things are, and then this kind of simplistic engineering approach is not the one that kind of allows to even think productively, right? So that's why we have to look at the wonders and the specifics and keep going into the smaller details. But as always, everything that we do is based on the utmost respect to the brain. Is that like our part is just to help the brain rather than to fight with it, right? Okay, so cheers, all the best.